In the summer of 1940, as Nazi Germany tightened its grip over Europe, a quiet young physicist walked into a room filled with Britain's most powerful men. The room was tense. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his war cabinet were trying to understand a terrifying mystery. German bombers were suddenly striking British targets with frightening precision, even at night, even through heavy clouds. Something invisible was guiding them. Standing in front of the cabinet was a 28-year-old scientist few of them had ever heard of. His name was Reginald Victor Jones. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a spy, he wasn't even a trained intelligence officer. Yet he was about to explain a discovery that would ignite one of the strangest and most secret battles of the Second World War. Jones believed the Germans had built invisible highways in the sky, radio beams that could guide bombers across hundreds of miles with mathematical precision. If he was right, Britain faced a new kind of warfare. Not tanks, not ships, but physics. To understand how such a young scientist ended up warning Churchill about invisible weapons, we have to go back nearly 3 decades, to South London in 1911. Reginald Victor Jones was born in the neighborhood of Herne Hill at 188 Railton Road. His background was far from the elite world of British science. His father had served as a sergeant in the Grenadier Guards before becoming a postman. The family lived modestly. There were no famous scientists in the household, no connections to powerful institutions. Yet from a young age, Jones displayed an intense curiosity about how the world worked. He was fascinated by radios, electrical devices, and the strange, invisible forces that traveled through the air. At a time when wireless technology still seemed almost magical, Jones spent hours experimenting with circuits and signals. He wasn't interested in fame or war. His dream was simple: to become a scientist. His intelligence soon became impossible to ignore. Jones won a scholarship that allowed him to study physics at the University of Oxford, one of the most prestigious academic institutions in the world. For a young man from a working-class family, it was an extraordinary opportunity. At Oxford, Jones studied under one of the most influential physicists in Britain, Frederick Lindemann. Lindemann was brilliant, controversial, and closely connected to political power. Years later, he would become one of Churchill's most trusted scientific advisors. But when Jones first met him, he was simply a demanding mentor who expected intellectual precision from his students. Jones thrived in this environment. He was meticulous, analytical, and unusually good at spotting patterns hidden in complex data. While other students focused on theoretical problems, Jones developed a talent that would later prove invaluable in intelligence work: the ability to connect small clues into a larger picture. Despite his success, Jones had no intention of entering the world of espionage. His interests were peaceful and academic. He planned to pursue a career in astronomy, studying the universe rather than weapons or warfare. But history had other plans. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within days, Britain and France declared war on Adolf Hitler's regime. The Second World War had begun. And suddenly the British government faced a terrifying question: what kind of new technologies might the Germans already be developing? Germany had some of the most advanced scientists in the world. Their engineers were experimenting with radar, rockets, and guided weapons. British intelligence agencies were excellent at gathering military information, but they had one major weakness. Most intelligence officers had no scientific training. They could analyze troop movements and spy reports, but they struggled to understand complex technological data. Someone in the British government proposed a radical solution. What if they recruited a scientist to work inside intelligence, someone capable of interpreting technical clues and predicting new enemy weapons? It was an unusual idea. At the time, intelligence services were dominated by soldiers, diplomats, and professional spies. A physicist had never been placed in such a role before. but the threat from Germany was growing too serious to ignore. In early 1939, the British Air Ministry decided to experiment. They created a small position inside their intelligence department focused entirely on analyzing possible enemy technologies. They needed someone young, brilliant, and capable of thinking creatively. Reginald Victor Jones was only 27 years old when he was chosen. The appointment surprised even him. Jones had little experience with military matters and no background in intelligence operations. But his analytical mind made him an ideal candidate for a completely new kind of warfare, one fought not with guns, but with ideas. His job description sounded deceptively simple. Investigate any rumors or evidence about new German weapons. In reality, the task was enormous. Germany was developing technologies that seemed almost futuristic. Radar systems that could detect aircraft miles away, magnetic mines capable of destroying ships without direct contact, rocket engines that might one day send missiles across entire continents. Jones quickly realized that traditional intelligence methods would not be enough. He needed to think like a scientist. Every report, every intercepted signal, every rumor from occupied Europe might contain a small fragment of truth. He began collecting information from dozens of different sources: scientific papers, spy reports, technical diagrams, and even seemingly insignificant comments overheard by travelers. Most of the data looked meaningless on its own, but Jones believed that somewhere within the chaos there was a pattern. Then, in November 1939, something extraordinary arrived at the British Embassy in Oslo. A mysterious package was delivered anonymously to the British naval attaché in Norway. Inside were 7 typed pages written by an unknown German scientist. The document described an astonishing list of secret German weapons and technologies. It mentioned radar systems capable of detecting aircraft miles away, radio beams used to guide bombers across Europe. It even referred to experimental rocket weapons being tested at a secret facility called Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. The document became known as the Oslo Report. Most British officials dismissed it immediately. The report sounded too extraordinary to be real. It described technologies that seemed years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. Some intelligence officers suspected it was deliberate disinformation designed to confuse British planners. Copies of the report were quietly filed away and largely forgotten. But Reginald Victor Jones saw something different. Instead of dismissing the document, he studied it line by line. Many of the technical descriptions were surprisingly precise. The author clearly understood advanced physics and engineering. Some of the ideas matched fragments of information Jones had already collected from other sources. If the Oslo Report was genuine, it meant Germany was far ahead in several areas of military technology. And one detail in particular caught Jones's attention. The report mentioned that German bombers might be guided by radio beams, signals transmitted from ground stations that aircraft could follow like invisible rails through the sky. If 2 beams crossed over a target, a bomber could simply follow one beam until it intersected with another, then release its bombs with remarkable accuracy. It sounded almost impossible, yet from a physics perspective, the concept made perfect sense. Jones started to wonder whether German bombers were already using such systems. At the time, most military leaders believed that night bombing was extremely inaccurate. Darkness, clouds, and navigation errors made precise targeting almost impossible. But if radio beams were guiding the aircraft, those limitations might disappear. Suddenly, the idea of invisible highways in the sky didn't seem so absurd. Jones started searching for evidence that these beams might exist. He examined German radio frequencies, navigation equipment, and bombing patterns. Slowly, piece by piece, a disturbing picture began to form. What he was discovering would soon trigger one of the most secret technological battles of World War II, a silent war fought through radio waves, deception, and scientific ingenuity. And at the center of it all stood a 28-year-old physicist who had never expected to become a spy.
In the early months of the Second World War, Britain faced a problem that few people fully understood. German bombers were crossing the North Sea and striking targets with unsettling accuracy. Even when clouds covered the sky, even when darkness should have made navigation nearly impossible, the bombs were falling dangerously close to their intended targets. To most military commanders, this seemed like coincidence or luck. Night bombing had always been notoriously inaccurate. Pilots navigated by stars, landmarks, and dead reckoning. Errors were common, and hitting a precise target in darkness was considered nearly impossible. But inside a small office within the British Air Ministry, a young physicist was beginning to suspect that something far more sophisticated was guiding those aircraft. Reginald Victor Jones had spent months studying scattered intelligence reports about German technology. At only 28 years old, he had been given an unusual task: identify any potential new weapons the Germans might be developing. Most of the reports he received were vague rumors, incomplete documents, or fragments of intercepted signals. But Jones had a talent for seeing patterns where others saw chaos. Then one particular document began to haunt him. In November 1939, an anonymous package had been delivered to the British naval attaché in Oslo, Norway. Inside were 7 typed pages written by an unknown German scientist. The document described a list of advanced German military technologies, some so futuristic that many British officials simply refused to believe them. The document soon became known as the Oslo Report. At first glance, it sounded like science fiction. It described radar systems capable of detecting aircraft miles away. It mentioned guided bombs, acoustic torpedoes, and magnetic naval mines. It even referred to a secret rocket research center on Germany's Baltic coast at Peenemünde. Most intelligence officers assumed the report was enemy propaganda. The technologies seemed too advanced, too ambitious. Some believed the Germans were deliberately feeding false information to confuse Allied planners. Copies of the report were filed away and quietly ignored. But Reginald Victor Jones did not ignore it. When he read the document, something immediately caught his attention. The technical descriptions were unusually precise. Whoever wrote it clearly had deep knowledge of German research programs. The language was calm, analytical, and detailed, not the exaggerated tone typical of propaganda. Jones suspected that the author might actually be a German scientist secretly warning Britain about dangerous weapons being developed inside the Third Reich. One passage in particular stood out. The report described a navigation system that used narrow radio beams transmitted from ground stations in Germany. Bombers equipped with special receivers could detect the beams and follow them across long distances. If 2 beams intersected over a target, the aircraft could drop their bombs exactly at the crossing point. It was an elegant idea. Instead of relying on visual navigation, German pilots could simply follow invisible radio signals through the night sky. Clouds would not matter, darkness would not matter. Even inexperienced crews could fly directly to their targets with remarkable accuracy. At first, the concept seemed almost unbelievable, but Jones knew enough physics to understand that it was entirely possible. Radio waves travel through the atmosphere in straight lines. With carefully designed transmitters and directional antennas, engineers could create narrow beams that stretched hundreds of miles. An aircraft receiver tuned to those frequencies could easily detect whether it was flying inside or outside the beam. If the Oslo report was correct, Germany might already possess a navigation system far more advanced than anything the British had imagined. Jones began to examine bombing reports from recent German raids. He studied maps showing where bombs had fallen and compared them with possible flight paths across the North Sea. Something unusual began to appear. In several cases, bombs seemed to fall along surprisingly straight lines extending inland from the coast. It was almost as if the aircraft had been following invisible corridors through the air. Jones wondered whether those corridors might actually exist. At this point, he faced a major challenge. There was no direct proof that the German beam system was real. The Oslo Report was still considered unreliable by many officials. If Jones wanted to convince the British government, he needed solid evidence. So he began to look for clues hidden inside German radio transmissions. Germany used numerous radio frequencies for communication and navigation. Most signals appeared ordinary, routine broadcasts for aircraft and ships, but Jones suspected that somewhere among those transmissions might be the narrow beams described in the Oslo Report. If he could identify their frequencies, Britain might be able to detect them. He began working with radio engineers and technicians, analyzing signal patterns and examining unusual transmissions coming from continental Europe. Slowly, a small number of suspicious signals began to stand out. They were highly directional and unusually powerful. The signals seemed to originate from German territory and pointed directly towards Britain. The pattern was strange enough to make Jones uneasy. Then another clue appeared. British intelligence began receiving reports from captured German equipment and interrogated prisoners, suggesting that German bombers were using a navigation system called Knickebein. The name translated roughly to crooked leg, though its true meaning remained unclear. To most intelligence officers, the name meant nothing, but Jones immediately connected it with the beam system described in the Oslo Report. If Knickebein was indeed a radio beam navigation system, it would confirm that Germany had developed the technology years ahead of Allied expectations. Jones urgently requested permission to test his theory. He proposed placing sensitive radio receivers in Britain tuned to possible German frequencies. If the beams existed, British technicians might detect them as narrow radio signals sweeping across the country. The idea sounded unconventional. Some senior officials remained skeptical, but the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. German bombing raids were intensifying, and Britain desperately needed answers. Eventually, Jones was allowed to proceed. Radio monitoring stations were set up to search for the mysterious signals. For days, the operators heard nothing unusual. Ordinary radio traffic filled the airwaves, but no narrow navigation beams appeared. Then, one night, a technician detected something strange. A powerful radio signal was sweeping slowly across southern England. It was extremely focused, far narrower than normal broadcasting transmissions. The signal moved like a spotlight, passing over towns and countryside before disappearing. Jones immediately realized what it meant. The beam was real. Germany had created exactly the kind of invisible navigation system described in the Oslo Report. Somewhere in occupied Europe, German transmitters were projecting narrow radio beams across the North Sea, guiding bombers directly towards British cities. It was a chilling discovery. If the system worked as effectively as Jones feared, German aircraft could attack targets with unprecedented accuracy, even in complete darkness. But the most alarming possibility was still ahead. If two beams crossed at a specific location, that intersection could act like a perfect aiming point. A bomber flying along one beam would simply release its bombs the moment it detected the second signal. In other words, Germany might already possess the ability to guide bombs to precise targets hundreds of miles away. Jones now faced a race against time. He needed to convince Britain's leadership that this invisible weapon existed and that it had to be stopped before it gave Germany a devastating advantage in the air war. What followed would soon become one of the extraordinary technological battles of World War II. A secret conflict fought not with guns or bombs, but with radio waves, mathematics, and deception. Historians would later call it the Battle of the Beams.
By the spring of 1940, the war in Europe was accelerating with terrifying speed.
Nazi Germany had already crushed Poland. Soon Denmark and Norway would fall. Then the German army would sweep through the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with shocking efficiency. Across the English Channel, Britain now stood almost alone. But another kind of threat was forming in the skies. German bombers were beginning to strike British targets more frequently, often at night when defenses were weakest. Darkness had always been the natural ally of attackers. Anti-aircraft guns struggled to track aircraft they could barely see, and fighter pilots found it extremely difficult to intercept bombers flying through clouds or heavy darkness. Yet something about the German raids seemed different. Instead of scattering their bombs randomly across wide areas, some Luftwaffe attacks appeared unusually precise. Certain factories, ports, and industrial zones were being hit with unsettling accuracy. It was almost as if the bombers knew exactly where they were going, even when they couldn't see the ground below. Inside the British Air Ministry, a young physicist was becoming increasingly convinced that the explanation lay in something invisible. Reginald Victor Jones had already uncovered evidence suggesting that Germany was using radio beams to guide its aircraft. These signals, transmitted from powerful ground stations, could act like invisible railways across the sky. A bomber equipped with the right receiver could simply follow the signal straight toward its target. The system, which German engineers called Knickebein, was brilliantly simple. A transmitter in occupied Europe would project a narrow radio beam across the North Sea. The signal would be carefully focused, only a few miles wide by the time it reached Britain. Inside the aircraft, a special receiver allowed the pilot to determine whether he was flying inside the beam or drifting away from it. If the aircraft moved slightly left or right, the signal would change. By correcting the course to keep the signal steady, the pilot could remain perfectly centered within the invisible corridor. It meant that navigation no longer depended on stars, landmarks, or maps. The beam itself became the road. But the true brilliance of the system appeared when two beams were used together. German engineers designed a second transmitter aimed so that its signal would cross the first beam at a precise location, often directly above a strategic target, such as a factory, harbor, or airfield. When the bomber flying along the first beam detected the second signal, the crew would know they had reached the exact point to release their bombs. Even through clouds, even in total darkness. For Jones, the implications were alarming. Traditional night bombing was inaccurate, partly because pilots had difficulty determining their exact position. But with radio beams acting as guides, that uncertainty could vanish. German bombers might be able to strike key targets with precision that had never before been possible at night. Jones needed proof that the system was already in operation. Working with British radio specialists, he began monitoring suspicious frequencies that might be connected to German navigation systems. The challenge was enormous. The radio spectrum was crowded with signals from military communications, commercial broadcasts, and experimental transmitters. Finding one narrow navigation beam among thousands of signals was like trying to hear a whisper inside a hurricane. But eventually, the evidence began to emerge. British monitoring stations detected powerful directional transmissions originating from German-controlled territory. These signals behaved exactly as Jones had predicted. They swept across Britain in narrow paths, sometimes lingering over particular regions before moving on. By mapping the direction of the signals, Jones realized something chilling. Some beams appeared to point directly toward British cities. To confirm the theory, the Royal Air Force conducted a series of tests. Aircraft equipped with special receivers were sent into the suspected beam paths. As they flew across the countryside, the pilots reported something extraordinary. They could clearly detect the signals. When they drifted slightly left or right, the tone inside their headphones changed, exactly as it would for a German bomber using the system.
Now, Jones knew that the invisible highways described in the Oslo Report were real. Germany had built a radio navigation network stretching across Europe and into Britain's airspace. The system allowed bombers to travel hundreds of miles and reach precise targets even when visibility was zero, and it was already being used. Soon, intelligence reports revealed more details about the system's design. The main transmitters were in Germany and occupied territories. Their antennas were carefully engineered to produce narrow directional beams that extended far beyond the coastline. The beams crossed the North Sea and reached deep into Britain. One of the primary targets was the industrial city of Birmingham. Another beam appeared to point toward the port of Liverpool. Others intersected above military factories and supply centers critical to the British war effort. German engineers essentially turned the night sky into a giant radio map. For the Luftwaffe crews flying those missions, the technology must have felt almost miraculous. Instead of struggling to navigate through darkness, they could follow the beam like a railway track in the sky. When the second signal appeared, they simply released their bombs. The system eliminated many of the traditional problems of night navigation, but it also created a vulnerability. Because the system relied entirely on radio signals, it could theoretically be disrupted. Jones realized that if Britain could interfere with the beams by bending them, masking them, or creating false signals, it might be possible to confuse the German bombers. Instead of guiding them to their targets, the beams could lead them somewhere else, perhaps even into open country or empty fields. It was a radical idea. No one had ever attempted to fight a battle using radio waves as weapons. Military strategy had always focused on aircraft, artillery, and ships, but Jones believed the real battlefield might be invisible, an electromagnetic war fought silently across the sky. Convincing Britain's leadership would not be easy. Many senior commanders still doubted that radio beams played a major role in German bombing accuracy. To them, the idea sounded like an elaborate scientific theory rather than a practical threat. But Jones had gathered enough evidence to make his case. He prepared to present his findings to the highest levels of the British government, including the man who now carried the enormous responsibility of leading the country through its darkest hour. Winston Churchill had just taken office as Prime Minister in May 1940, at a moment when Britain's survival was far from guaranteed. France was collapsing under German attack, and many feared that Britain might soon face invasion. In that atmosphere of urgency and uncertainty, Jones delivered his warning. Germany had created invisible radio beams guiding their bombers across Europe. If the system remained unchallenged, the Luftwaffe could strike British industry and infrastructure with growing precision. But if Britain acted quickly, the beams could be turned against their creators. What followed would become one of the strangest technological duels of the entire war, a secret conflict fought not with bombs or bullets, but with transmitters, receivers, and the invisible energy flowing through the air. The coming struggle would later be known as the Battle of the Beams, and its outcome would help decide whether Germany could dominate the skies over Britain.
By the summer of 1940, Britain stood on the edge of catastrophe. France had collapsed, the German army controlled most of Western Europe, and across the English Channel, the Luftwaffe was preparing to break Britain's ability to resist. Night after night, waves of German bombers crossed the North Sea, heading toward British cities, factories, and airfields. The air war was becoming increasingly dangerous. Bombs were falling closer to strategic targets. Industrial centers that powered Britain's war effort were being struck with unsettling accuracy. Many commanders believed the Germans had simply improved their navigation and bombing techniques. But inside the British Air Ministry, one young physicist believed something far more sophisticated was guiding those aircraft.
Reginald Victor Jones had already gathered evidence that German bombers were following invisible radio beams projected from transmitters in occupied Europe. These beams allowed aircraft to navigate with precision even in total darkness. Jones knew that if the system continued operating unchecked, the Luftwaffe might gain a decisive advantage in the bombing war. He needed to convince Britain's leadership, and quickly. In June 1940, Jones presented his findings to the highest levels of the British government. Among those listening carefully was the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill was not a scientist, but he understood the importance of technological warfare. Radar had already proven critical in defending Britain's airspace. If Germany had developed another revolutionary navigation system, ignoring it could be disastrous. Jones explained how the German beams worked. Transmitters in Europe projected narrow radio signals across the North Sea. Bombers equipped with receivers followed the signals like invisible roads. When a second beam crossed the first above a target, the crew released their bombs at the precise intersection point. The method was elegant, efficient, and dangerous. But Jones also explained the system's weakness. Because the navigation relied entirely on radio signals, those signals could potentially be manipulated. If Britain transmitted a stronger signal on the same frequency, the German receiver might follow the British beam instead of the original one. If the signals were shifted slightly, the bomber might think it was flying directly toward its target when it was actually drifting miles away. It was a new kind of warfare, electronic warfare. Churchill immediately grasped the opportunity. If Jones was correct, Britain might be able to sabotage the entire German navigation system without firing a single shot. Instead of destroying bombers in the air, they could quietly disrupt the guidance system that led them to their targets. Churchill authorized urgent countermeasures. British engineers and scientists were tasked with building transmitters capable of interfering with the German beams. The operation had to move quickly. The Luftwaffe was already intensifying its bombing campaign, and Britain's industrial infrastructure could not afford devastating precision strikes. Within weeks, radio specialists began experimenting with ways to distort the beams. The simplest idea was jamming. By transmitting powerful noise signals on the same frequency as the German beam, British stations could overwhelm the navigation receivers inside the bombers. If the signal became too chaotic, the pilots might lose the beam entirely and be forced to rely on traditional navigation. But Jones suspected that even better methods existed. Instead of simply blocking the beam, Britain might be able to bend it. If British transmitters rebroadcast the signal slightly to one side, the receiver could interpret the shifted signal as the correct course. The aircraft would faithfully follow the beam, but the beam itself would be leading them somewhere else, maybe a few miles away from the intended target, maybe over empty countryside. Engineers quickly began building equipment designed to do exactly that. Secret transmitters were installed in strategic locations across Britain. Their purpose was not to broadcast ordinary signals, but to manipulate the invisible radio highways guiding the German bombers. The first real test came during a German raid aimed at industrial targets in northern England. As the bombers approached British airspace, monitoring stations detected the familiar navigation beams sweeping across the country. British transmitters activated and began broadcasting their counter signals. Inside the German aircraft, the receivers responded exactly as Jones had predicted. The signals appeared normal. The pilots believed they were perfectly aligned with the navigation beam guiding them toward their targets. Confident in the system, they continued following the signal across the darkened landscape. But something had changed. The beam they were following was no longer pointing at the factory complex they intended to bomb. British transmitters had shifted the signal slightly, bending the invisible corridor of radio energy. By the time the bombers reached the supposed intersection point and released their bombs, they were no longer over their intended targets. Many bombs fell harmlessly into open countryside. From the perspective of the German crews, nothing seemed unusual. Their instruments had worked perfectly. The beam had guided them exactly where it was supposed to. Yet the results on the ground told a different story. Targets that should have been destroyed remained intact. German engineers quickly realized that something was interfering with their navigation systems. In response, they began modifying the technology. New beam systems were developed with slightly different frequencies and more complex signal patterns. But each time the Germans changed their system, Jones and his team studied the signals and devised new countermeasures. The battle became a technological duel. German engineers attempted to refine their beams to prevent interference. British scientists worked to detect and distort the signals as quickly as possible. Each side constantly adapted, trying to stay one step ahead of the other. Historians would later call this invisible conflict the Battle of the Beams. Unlike traditional battles, no soldier saw the battlefield. No explosions marked the turning points. The struggle unfolded silently through radio waves traveling across the night sky. Yet the consequences were enormous. By disrupting the German navigation beams, Britain reduced the accuracy of the Luftwaffe bombing raids. Factories, ports, and airfields that might have been devastated were spared serious damage. The German bombing campaign became less effective and more unpredictable. For Churchill, the young physicist who had warned about the beams proved invaluable. Churchill later referred to Jones as the man who broke the bloody beams. What made the achievement even more remarkable was how unconventional it was. Jones was not commanding fighter squadrons or designing new weapons. Instead, he was fighting a war of signals and ideas, an intellectual battlefield where physics could defeat bombs. But the Battle of the Beams was only the beginning. As the war continued, Jones would uncover even more dangerous German technologies, including rockets and advanced guided weapons being developed at a secret facility on the Baltic coast. And the next discovery might prove even more terrifying than invisible radio beams.
By late 1941, the secret struggle over radio beams had proven something remarkable. Science had become a weapon. Invisible signals, carefully studied and manipulated, had helped protect British cities from more accurate German bombing. But for Reginald Victor Jones, the Battle of the Beams was only the beginning. The war of technology was accelerating. Germany was investing enormous resources into experimental weapons, devices that often sounded like science fiction. Rockets capable of traveling faster than sound, guided bombs that could steer themselves toward ships, torpedoes that could track the sound of enemy propellers underwater. Most of these ideas seemed too advanced to be real, but Jones had learned something important during the beam battle. The Germans were often much closer to success than anyone expected. The same mysterious document that had first warned him about radio navigation beams still lingered in his thoughts. The Oslo Report had predicted far more than navigation systems. It described experimental rockets, advanced radar, and a secret research facility located on the Baltic coast. The location mentioned in the report was a place called Peenemünde. At the time the report arrived in 1939, most British officials had dismissed the claim. Rockets capable of striking distant targets sounded unrealistic, almost fantastical. Military planners were focused on aircraft, tanks, and naval warfare. Rockets were usually associated with fireworks or small experimental devices. But Jones knew that some German scientists had been experimenting with large liquid-fueled rockets even before the war began. If those experiments had continued in secret, the results could be dangerous. Over the next several years, Jones and his colleagues began searching for clues that might confirm what was happening at Peenemünde. Intelligence reports from occupied Europe occasionally mentioned unusual construction activity along the Baltic coast.
Intercepted communications hinted at large-scale testing programs involving unfamiliar technologies, but solid evidence remained frustratingly scarce. Peenemünde was one of the most secret research centers in the Third Reich. The facility was controlled by the German army and protected by strict security. Few spies managed to approach it, and even fewer understood what they were seeing. Still, small fragments of information began to accumulate. Aerial reconnaissance photographs revealed long launch ramps and unusual buildings that did not resemble conventional aircraft factories. Reports from resistance networks described strange explosions heard across the Baltic coast. Some witnesses claimed to have seen objects streaking into the sky, leaving trails of fire behind them. Jones studied every piece of information carefully. Slowly, he began to realize that the Germans were indeed developing rockets far more powerful than anything previously built. These weapons would later become known as the V-weapons, short for vengeance weapons, or Vergeltungswaffen. The most famous of them were the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile. The V-2 in particular represented a terrifying breakthrough. Unlike conventional bombs dropped by aircraft, the V-2 was a rocket that traveled faster than the speed of sound. Once launched, it climbed high into the upper atmosphere before falling toward its target at enormous speed. There was no warning siren, no approaching aircraft sound. The explosion came first. If deployed in large numbers, such weapons could bypass traditional air defenses entirely. Jones understood the danger immediately. If Germany completed its rocket program and began mass production, British cities could face attacks that were almost impossible to stop. Once again, intelligence became the key weapon. Jones and other analysts worked tirelessly to confirm the location of the rocket development program. By combining aerial photographs, spy reports, and intercepted signals, they gradually built a clearer picture of the activities at Peenemünde. Eventually, the evidence became convincing enough to act. In 1943, the Allies launched a major bombing operation against the research center. The attack was designed to disrupt the rocket program before it could reach full production. British bombers flew across the Baltic Sea and struck the facility with heavy explosives. The raid caused significant damage and delayed the development of Germany's rocket weapons. Although the V-2 would eventually be deployed later in the war, the program lost valuable time and resources. For Jones, the mission confirmed the growing importance of scientific intelligence. Throughout the war, new technologies continued to emerge. Radar systems, guided missiles, electronic countermeasures, and advanced aircraft designs. Understanding these innovations often required scientific knowledge as much as traditional espionage. Jones had helped create an entirely new field of warfare, the systematic analysis of enemy technology. Instead of waiting for weapons to appear on the battlefield, scientists could predict them, identify their weaknesses, and develop countermeasures before they caused catastrophic damage. The impact of this approach extended far beyond the Second World War. After the war ended, intelligence agencies around the world began building permanent scientific analysis units. Physicists, engineers, and mathematicians became integral members of intelligence organizations, helping governments understand emerging technologies and potential threats. Jones himself continued working in science and intelligence for many years, eventually becoming one of the most respected figures in the field. His experiences during the war were later described in his memoir, Most Secret War, which revealed many of the hidden battles fought behind the front lines. Despite his achievements, Jones remained far less famous than many military leaders of the era. Yet his work quietly shaped the outcome of critical moments in the war. By recognizing the threat of German navigation beams, he helped reduce the effectiveness of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaign. By identifying the danger of rocket weapons, he contributed to efforts that delayed one of Germany's most advanced programs. Churchill once referred to him as the man who broke the bloody beams. It was a simple phrase, but it captured something profound. In a war often remembered for massive armies and devastating battles, victory sometimes depended on individuals who fought in silence, analyzing signals, decoding patterns, and uncovering secrets hidden within complex technologies. Reginald Victor Jones was one of those individuals, a young physicist who entered the war expecting to study the universe and instead helped reveal the invisible weapons shaping the future of warfare.